Good evening, everyone. I'd first like to acknowledge the Kaurna people, the original custodians of the Adelaide Plains, on which all of the University of Adelaide's campuses at the Waite, Roseworthy, Deverton and here on North Terrace are based. Welcome everyone to tonight's Research Tuesday, the latest in our series of free public seminars by leading researchers at the University of Adelaide. I'm Professor Robert Saint, Pro Vice-Chancellor of Research Strategy. I shouldn't have to read that, should I? Here at the University of Adelaide. Now, I fear that I have to say that we have a horrible topic for you this evening. Actually, that's not true at all. It's a fascinating topic concerning one of the great genres of cinema, the horror movie. Horror's been around in one form or another since the very earliest days of cinema. But how horror is changing and what does it say about our society? To give us an insight into these topics and more, tonight we have with us Dr. Ben McCann to present a talk entitled Bumps in the Night. Ben is an Associate Professor in French Studies at the University of Adelaide. His main focus of teaching and research is French cinema, and he's authored, edited and co-edited a number of books on this topic. Tonight we'll hear about the important role of French horror cinema, why it's at the cutting edge, so to speak, and importantly, what it says about us. Would you please join me in welcoming our speaker for tonight, Associate Professor Ben McCann.
Thanks, Professor. Before we get started, ladies and gentlemen, I need to just show you this disclaimer. Obviously, you wouldn't have gotten here tonight without thinking that there would need to be a disclaimer, but I thought long and hard today about whether I should show clips or not, and anybody that's seen me over the last couple of days on the Level 8 corridor has thought, am I agonising about what clips to show? The clips I've shown, I hope, are not too graphic. The images I'm about to show are not too graphic. If my wife, who's in the audience, can handle them, I'm sure anybody else can. But just to let you know, I'm kind of duty-bound to put that disclaimer up. Okay.
Impatiente comme j'aime. Je te présente Déborah Gessel.
C'est quoi cette merde?
So a young French woman recently arrived in Bucharest, Romania to teach French, returns home late one night and complains to her French boyfriend that her Romanian students are troublesome and ill-disciplined. One night in their isolated house on the outskirts of the city, the couple is awoken by unseen intruders who turn the television on and off, cut telephone and power lines, and eventually force the couple to play a deadly game of cat and mouse. Paris, the near future. An extreme far-right presidential candidate is on the verge of taking power. In the ensuing riots, a gang of looting criminals escape to the countryside and stop at a roadside motel run by a gang of neo-Nazi cannibals looking to establish a new world order. It's Christmas Eve, and a heavily pregnant young girl is about to give birth when a mysterious scissor-wielding woman calls at the house, wanting Sarah's baby by any means necessary. So welcome everybody to the repulsive, explicit, subversive, dreadful, horrific, and frankly quite terrifying world of French horror cinema in the 21st century. Horror cinema is big business today. Think of the recent success of Japanese, Spanish, Korean, British, and even Australian horror, or the perpetual cycle of American remakes of 1980s franchises like Halloween, Nightmare on Elm Street, and Friday the 13th. Nowadays, digital imagery and special effects make it even easier to frighten us. Multiplexes and home cinema sound systems are so sophisticated that we shudder as a door creaks open or a shadowy figure skulks towards us. Horror films thrive at the box office around the world by upping the ante, providing a more gruesome alternative to what came last year. Even sometimes something derivative. Young people wandering around a haunted house, as you just saw in the trailer for Livid, recast that in a new light. Denigrated in French cultural circles for many years, horror is back. Here we see a strong, intelligent, commercially driven horror genre in which the human body is subjected to often violent, traumatic breaches. Some of these films reveal their hand slowly, building inexorably towards a climax. Others tempt the audience with the promise of an almost pornographic pleasure in seeing the body opened up in increasingly graphic ways. Yet beneath the thrills and the chills, there is something far more interesting going on, because horror films, whether French or otherwise, are always about something else. The vampire is a metaphor for AIDS. The zombie is a satire of mindless consumerism. The Saw series and the Hostel series in America are all about post-9/11 sensibilities. If each era chooses the monster it deserves and then projects it, then this current French era has chosen a very strange monster indeed, themselves. So in the last 15 years or so, in film after film, as you can see on the slide behind me, French cinema has thrived on unsettling the audience on a visceral, violent level. Some are slasher films, others are rural gothic horrors, others are supernatural, others still focus on the threat of domestic invasion. Over the last few years, as you can see, zombies have made a big comeback. Others have combined genres, mixing horror with comedy, horror with 18th century pre-revolutionary French martial arts, and with Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Bloody Mallory from 2002. What a great film that is. Now, I should start out by prefacing my speech by saying that all of these films, in fact, most of them, are terrible, unwatchable to the point of absurdity, as envelopes are pushed further and further, and that peculiar French pastime of épater la bourgeoisie is increasingly ramped up as excess is piled upon excess. Yet the sheer number of these films suggests a French horror cycle that has become increasingly fertile, and an increasingly fertile terrain to interrogate what it's like to live in France today. Now, it's perhaps worth reminding ourselves, first of all, about some commonplaces of French cinema. France was where cinema was born, on the 28th of December, 1895, to be exact. In the back room of a small cafe in Paris, two brothers screen a 50-second documentary short film entitled The Arrival of a Train at a Station. And that's exactly what the film was about. A train emerges from the distance, draws into the station, and passengers get on and off. What audiences saw that day was a single, unedited view illustrating an aspect of everyday French life. But on that day was also born an urban legend. Some said and wrote afterwards that as the train moved directly towards the camera, some spectators were so terrified at that first screening that many ran from the cafe, screaming in horror, fearful that the train would exit the screen and hit them. So perhaps the DNA of today's French horror films begin at that very moment, that moving images could produce a powerful sensation of fear, dread, and the survival instinct. France is the home of the Cannes Film Festival. It has a capital city that has the highest density of movie theatres anywhere in the world, and a mindset that terms cinema the seventh art, alongside poetry and sculpture and architecture and music and so on. It's noted for having a particularly strong film industry, due in part to the protections afforded it by the French government. In France, American films have only 50% of the market share, compared with 90% in the UK and 94% in Australia. DVDs of French films released in the cinema can only be released 6 months after the initial screening at the cinema, so as to ensure a solid revenue stream for smaller cinemas across the country. And first-time directors are afforded tax breaks and extensive support. In 2009, over 40% of all films made in France were made by those making a film for the very first time. 216 million film tickets were sold in France in 2011, making it the third biggest market in the world in terms of admissions, after the US and India, and revenues after the US and Japan. It's the most successful film industry in Europe in terms of films produced per annum, a record-breaking 282 last year. When we think of French cinema, we often tend to think of a set of films that possesses an almost documentary-like faithfulness to reality. It's a cinema intent on capturing real life, depicting real events, real people, sometimes with compassion, sometimes with anger, but always with clarity and empathy. And we all have our favourite French genre. Maybe it's the romantic comedy with Audrey Tautou and Romain Duris. Maybe it's an earnest costume drama with Juliette Binoche. Maybe it's a slow-burning tale of small-town passion with Kristen Scott Thomas. Or maybe it's Asterix and Obelix, starring the ubiquitous Gérard Depardieu. 208 films and counting over a 40-year period. But if we look at the highest grossing films of all time in France, the top 20 highest grossing films of all time, we can see that by and large the French are a fairly representative example of the global cinematic audience. Indeed, for a public supposedly more noted than others for favouring a more independent, art house, non-Hollywood style of film, the French are actually really not that different from the rest of us. As you can see, there's plenty of Walt Disney, plenty of James Cameron, and plenty of Charlton Heston. But horror doesn't feature. The highest ranking horror film is 99th. It's The Exorcist from 1973, which pulled in 6.7 million spectators. An American film made nearly 40 years ago. What domestic product does make it to the top of the list, as you can see, is comedy. Welcome to the Sticks and The Untouchables, big successes over the last few years. But I would argue that comedy is hardly a genre suited to ask the cold, hard questions about the society in which we live. So, the recent emergence of a distinct French corpus of horror films is somewhat surprising, given the general perception of French cinema as a cinema of reality, of realism, of truthfulness, little inclined to explore the fantastic or the grotesque. But it's my belief that French cinema should not just be seen as idyllic views of the Eiffel Tower or amorous couples cycling through green pastures, playing pétanque and sipping Chablis. There's something far more unsettling out there. Horror films in France nowadays often take place within supposed safe surroundings. Homes, schools, universities, woods, city streets, shopping centres. All of these spaces are full of a brooding sense of unease emanating from the everyday world you and I recognise. The monsters are not little green men from Mars, but are murderous children, female serial killers, neo-Nazi cannibals. They are a projection of a particular set of fears that simply do not correspond with the dominant paradigms of what we think modern existence in France is like. Stable, civilised, orthodox, sophisticated. But instead, these films embody modes of disruption that threaten the consensual frameworks of modern French society. Something is clearly rotten in the body politic. The real horrors in these films are not so much political as bodily, as what happens to the body. Zombie films like Mutants behind me from 2009, The Horde from 2010, and the recent TV series The Returned were all released in a recession-hit France, and all offer a foretaste of the apocalypse in which society has broken down and the iniquities of capitalism have spawned breeds of flesh-eating mutants. In the film version of The Returned from 2004, entitled They Came Back, the first image of the film is hundreds of thousands of people rising from the dead and walking through the streets of Paris. And a voiceover tells us initial estimates have stated that more than 70 million men and women have returned to the world. Even respected directors like Claire Denis, more suited to costume dramas and literary adaptations, has dipped her toe in the water. Trouble Every Day is your typical story of girl meets cannibal. So many of these films situate horror in the everyday world of contemporary France and project that horror onto a foreign invader. French horror then currently represents a collective nightmare of a nation undergoing social and political fragmentation, condemning itself to annihilation, while all the while pushing at the gates lie the barbarians. This new batch of films sits much closer to the conventional horror thematics of American cinema. The French directors may seek to interrogate deeper cultural and political anxieties, but they're also careful to satisfy their core audience, seek worldwide distribution for their films, and gain praise or notoriety, depending on your point of view, as proponents of popular genre cinema in a cinematic climate that has always jealously guarded the idea of the auteur cinema, cinema as intimate and psychological and personal. If nothing else, these new films tonight offer an alternative to the French cinema most are familiar with. So where does it all come from? This tradition of bumps in the night and sheer, unadulterated, it's behind you terror. Now, what I hope to share with you this evening is that the emergence of French horror in modern cinema taps into pre-existing traditions of the grand guignol and the fantastique that suggest that French horror should be taken more seriously. It's not simply a throwaway addition to the canon, but highly revealing of French fears at the start of the 21st century. Films like Them, Inside, and Frontiers, the three that I showed you at the beginning, are all engaged with a fascinating dialogue with recent political events in France, grafting metaphors of border insecurity and domestic invasion onto their narratives of visual excess. What characterizes these films and the films you saw on the list are claustrophobic atmospheres of anxiety and a nagging sense of unease emanating from the familiar supposed normality of the world. At the end of the day, they are nihilistic in many ways, bespeaking an ideological emptiness at the heart of modern French society. I'm not spoiling anything tonight by telling you that none of our heroines and heroes survive in these films. They're all killed at the end. So in order to understand where French horror comes from, we need to go back into the past. And the four most common aspects of recent French horror tapping into the past are bodily excess, psychological horror, exploitation, and body horror. And these films essentially recycle and respond to those previous artistic precursors. Now, France's horror film heritage arguably stems from the turn of the 20th century popularity of the Théâtre du Grand Guignol in Paris, a theatre that specialized in graphic horror shows. And you can see some of the acts there on the right-hand side of the sorts of things that were shown to audiences over 100 years ago now. And in fact, in the theatre, I was reading about this a few days ago, they built special rooms where distressed patrons could go and compose themselves, have a glass of wine, lie down, and then return, obviously, for the second act when they'd the blood had returned to their heads. Also important is Méliès. We often think that it was the Lumière brothers that invented cinema, and in many ways they did. But for those of you who've seen the film Hugo, you will know that Georges Méliès is an incredibly important part of early French cinema, but also other national cinemas around the world as well, with his use of special effects, with his use of cinema as a device that could trick, that could create worlds of illusion. Well, in fact, one of his first films, The Devil's Castle, was also, in fact, the very first depiction of the devil on film. And it showcased the potential for cinema to traffic in the supernatural. Louis Buñuel's Un chien andalou, an Andalusian dog from 1929, takes a different course, moving away from manufactured scares towards a clinical depiction of body horror. The celebrated shot of a woman's eye being slit open with a razor, don't worry, we're not going to watch it, suggested the perversities of human behaviour through horrific imagery. It is on YouTube, by the way, if you wish to look at that tonight. For several years afterwards, French horror cinema revolved around numerous adaptations of classic horror literature, such as the retelling of the Faust legend in The Devil's Hand, Jean Cocteau's Beauty and the Beast, and Jean Renoir's version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the Testament of Dr. Cordelier. Other touchstones include Henri-Georges Clouzot's The Fiends, in which a woman and her husband's mistress plot to murder the man. But for those of you who haven't seen the film, that's all I'm going to say. And then there's Georges Franju's Eyes Without a Face in 1959, in which a plastic surgeon kidnaps young women, removes their faces, and attempts to graft them onto his own disfigured daughter, with predictably unsettling results. So this is the start of the mad scientist horror genre in France. For example, we have Edmund Greville's The Hands of Orlok, which sees a concert pianist's hands substituted in an operation with those of a murderer, of a serial killer, and the hands begin to take over the concert pianist's personality. Then comes the sexploitation and fantasy cinema of Jean Rollin. His The Rape of the Vampire in 1968 established new levels of extreme sexuality and graphic violence that capitalized on a relaxing of French censorship laws and the emergence of pornography into mainstream French culture. Rollin's fusing of sex and violence in this film and many others in his vampire series should not be dismissed as mere pulp horror. Instead, working consistently, independently, and under budget throughout the 1960s and 70s, he can in many ways be regarded as a filmmaker as audacious and as important as Jean-Luc Godard and Bertrand Tavernier. Despite his audacious subject matter, these films were not pornographic or misogynistic. Rather, they elucidated the very clear cultural links that we're perhaps familiar with between horror and eroticism. Rollin also dabbled in another staple of French exploitation cinema, the zombie film. His zombie trilogy capitalizes on George Romero's zombie trilogy from America 10 years or so earlier. And what we can see here are the lake of zombies, Zombie Lake, in which his zombies are Nazis, while Les Raisins de la Mort, the grapes of death, contained an ecological message expressing concern about pesticides and environmental damage. For years, the farmers have been using the wrong kind of pesticide, and it's infected the wine and turned everybody that drinks the wine into zombies. So a kind of a combining there of ecological messages and exploitation. Now, two further trends of French horror have emerged in the last few years. What's known in French as cinéma du corps, the cinema of the body, and the shock horror that I'd like to talk about tonight. The first trend, cinema of the body, does not produce or reproduce horror in the traditional sense, but instead embraces images of the abject in order to interrogate issues of female and male identity, the crisis of masculinity, sexual violence, and so on. And they use that very often with images of the pornographic and the abject. This new extreme strand of French cinema that I'd like to talk about today continues to be fascinated by the figure of the vampire, which continues that link that I was talking about before from the 1960s. Vampires surface constantly throughout this recent period, even in that very nice romantic portmanteau film called Paris, I Love You from 2006. For those of you who know the film will know that there's a 5-minute section in which Elijah Wood meets a vampire who proceeds to kill him, as vampires are wont to do. The prolonged appearance of the vampire, I think, hints at a collective unease about the nature of globalization in France. For the films in which vampires appear suggest that vampires thrive within the big city. They function as a kind of monstrous representation of insatiable greed and breachable borders. These vampires appear and disappear at will. They're often invisible, elusive, and in turn this has been referred back to France's current interrogation and concern with illegal and clandestine immigration. This threat to the integrity of the human body in recent French horror is part of a far wider discussion that we can see in French cinema over the last 20 years around the idea of social breakdown and border insecurity. And then we come to the shock horror tradition of French cinema that revels in strategies of sophisticated special effects to look at some of these films. So, The Pack, for example. Now, what do we mean when we talk about French films? They are at the vanguard of a new horror movement that's been enthusiastically greeted by French and non-French audiences. DVD rentals and sales of these films are not just commercially successful in France, but also in Latin America, Asia, and Australia. 3 times in the last month, SBS has broadcast a French horror film. Type in the words French horror film into Google, and you are led into a maze of fan sites, blogs, and long-form essays from aficionados across the world. Now, traditional analysis of horror films has always looked to equate the theme or the content of the film with a particular social concern of the time. Familiar examples of this would be from 1950s American science fiction films, The Thing from Another World, Them, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which are on the surface explorations of alien invasion or the risks of nuclear power, but also offer a deeper interrogation of xenophobia, anti-communism, and technological change. More recently, the term torture porn has been used to describe extreme, prolonged graphic torture, rape, and dismemberment in American films such as the Saw series from 2004 to 2011 and Hostel 1 and 2, 2005, 2007. All of these works willingly confront the audience with visceral, grotesque imagery and implicit political content that reflect post-9/11 anxieties surrounding torture, Guantanamo Bay, and the Bush administration's policy towards the threats potentially posed by outsiders. Likewise, French horror combines graphic violence and gore with explicit social and political implications. In film after film, the integrity of the human body is revealed not as impregnable, but as ripe for invasion and mutation. Inside, Them and Frontiers situate their horrors in the here and now of modern France. All of these films contain images of the autumn riots of 2005 that began in Paris by primarily Arab, North African, and Black French second-generation immigrants and spread to several metropolitan cities across the country, causing billions of euros of damage and setting governmental policy towards young immigrants back a generation. As such, the physical destruction of the body in these films reflects the fractures that exist in the body politic. Now, as I mentioned before, Them takes place in the Romanian capital, Bucharest. The film successfully incorporates many of those elements of the horror film that we are familiar with. A pre-credit sequence involving a car that breaks down in a forest. A deliberately slow exposition where creaks and noises of the house are revealed as simply that, creaks and noises of the house, but we're not sure. And that rhythmic structure of success, failure, escaping the villain, and then eventually being captured by him. They all seem to recall that idea of domestic invasion horror cinema that has been a very common element in American horror cinema of the last 30 years or so. But more recently has migrated into French works like Harry, He's Here to Help from 2000, Lemming from 2005, and most brilliantly and audaciously in Michael Haneke's Hidden from 2005 in which a nice middle-class Parisian couple are inexplicably sent a series of increasingly violent drawings and videotapes. Broadly speaking, all of these scenarios are politically motivated because the privacy of the home stands for the integrity of the bourgeois family. And questions are being asked of us. Will the family stand up to the pressure? Can it be defended? Is it even worth defending? The poster tagline for them cements those ideological inclinations. Translated from French, you'll never feel safe in your own home again, and deliberately calls into question the notion of the home as fortress. The film persistently evokes permeability, susceptibility of domestic space, most notably in an early scene where Clementine pops her eye through a keyhole to see what's on the other side and almost has it gouged out by a screwdriver. Such images push us towards a more allegorical reading of them, one that perceives the struggle between the French couple and the Romanian intruders as the playing out of larger geopolitical and cultural tensions that lie at the heart of the European project and the French attitude towards that union. The themes of alienation and annihilation exploit very real French anxieties about the growth of the European Union and critique the benefits of greater European integration and freedom of movement. Don't forget that Bulgaria and Romania joined the EU in January of 2007, shortly before them began filming. So it seems that this invasion of domestic space plays on very real French fears about a threatened cultural identity. The couple's sense of superiority is flagged throughout. He is a writer, she is a teacher, and she uses French dictation exercises to calm down her Romanian students who are talking too much. Might start using that one myself. But those ideas of superiority are rapidly destabilized once the traditional parameters of the home have been transgressed by those children no longer learning or speaking French, but communicating via coughs and whispers, because the twist of the film is that the invaders, the killers, are in fact the children that the French woman is teaching earlier on in the film. So perhaps France's benevolent civilizing mission will always remain undermined. France seeks to impose a cultural patrimony and incorporate an enlightened republicanism into these new European states like Bulgaria and Romania, but such a mission is doomed to failure. France has always maintained a very careful balancing act with the European Union. On the one hand, they're pro-integrationist and pro-federalising. On the other, they're deeply nationalistic and highly sceptical towards the fast-tracking of Eastern Bloc countries and ex-Soviet satellite states. The Romania in them is presented as a deeply negative space. Nothing works, the phones don't work, the police don't come to the house when they are telephoned. In the film's eyes, these children, these murderous children, are representative not just of mass immigration, who the French have called the Polish plumber, that is to say, immigrants that come from the East with skills that they can then use to usurp highly skilled French domestic employed nationals. But also these children suggest a wider cultural mass that is primed to invade French borders and challenge the dominant culture. And what do the children wear? Hoodies. Hoodies, and they use football rattles to communicate. So of course, the right-wing press, both in the UK and in France, had a field day when it came to analysing this film, because they realised that the hooded top, is symbolic of a certain kind of youth in Europe at the moment. The hoodie means menace, the hoodie means anger, the hoodie means danger, and is inscribed with a meaning that the wearer is up to no good. I don't think anyone's wearing a hoodie here, but you're forgiven. Now, of course, what else comes from Romania? Well, Dracula does. And we've seen, of course, that the vampire is a recurring figure in French cinema. But this figure, this image behind me, is typical of many that we saw during the time of Sarkozy's presidency, equating Sarkozy with Dracula, hidden, nefarious, and cunning. I'd like to come back to Sarkozy shortly because he's an important part of this discussion. Now, at first glance, Inside is a very different film from them. Instead of the restrained style that we see in them, the co-directors of this film seek to extend that predilection for harrowing imagery by adopting an unrelenting, gut-wrenching approach to telling their own story around this idea of the domestic invasion. But there are similar ideas going on. The inside of the title refers both to the film's isolated Paris house, but also the interior of Sarah's belly. She is 9 months pregnant. And the domestic invasion scenario is marshalled again as a means of interrogating recent events. Once again, let's have a look at the film's tagline, "Terror comes calling." Far from a genre exercise in gratuitous shock tactics, Inside evokes the fear of pierced borders, both on a corporeal and on a social level. And this is reflected in a very revealing scene in which the main character there, who is cowering behind the cabinet, opens the film watching images of those riots that we talked about before that were burning in Paris, not too far away from her home, in October and November of 2005. Now, the walls around the city of Paris, the Parisian border, were also traditionally referred to as the pregnant Parisian woman, the enceinte parisienne, which makes the events in the house a highly metaphorical confrontation between Paris residents within and a highly disaffected group of youths from without that nightly threatened to breach those walls and bring violence and retribution from the suburbs into the heart of Paris. For Sarah's belly, we can read the vulnerable permeability of the city and a battle between the civilized and the outsider, the integrated and the disenfranchised. Them and Inside both conform to what we can call paranoid horror. That is, not secure horror. Secure horror is structured around an external threat where human actions are meaningful, the monster is defeated, good wins out over evil, narrative closure is guaranteed, we leave the cinema happily ever after. Paranoid cinema, on the other hand, is patterned around far less clearly marked binaries. The threat is internal, human action is unsuccessful, doubt is pervasive, and the narrative remains unresolved. Thus, France's own fear of excessive immigration is embodied in the narrative patterns of paranoid horror. So these current preoccupations with migration, immigration, and border porosity are well served in Them and Inside. Now, the last film that I want to look at develops further my idea of pierced entry points and constitutes a pioneering example of what others and I have termed Sarkozy horror. That is, films that were released at the time that Sarkozy was in power. If horror films suggest violent disruptions in the everyday world, transgressing violent boundaries, then Xavier Gance's Frontières literally continues this ongoing preoccupation with borders and thresholds. More so than Them and Inside, Frontiers presents a political narrative that grafts images of inner city riots and street lootings similar to those of October and November 2005 onto the popular genre framework of the film. The remainder of the film documents the battle for survival between the multicultural and multiracial youths of Paris who escape into the dark heart of the countryside. Now, Frontiers reflects a number of contemporary anxieties. Most notably, remember, the film opens with an extreme far-right president on the verge of winning the presidential election. It was released in July 2007, a mere 2 months after the presidential election victory of Nicolas Sarkozy. And in its use of urban riots and an aggressive police response to them, it recalls once again the events of autumn 2005 and Sarkozy's then denunciation of the rioters as, quote, scum. As this slide demonstrates, one of the key aspects of Sarkozy's 2007 presidential campaign was to appropriate the rhetoric of the current far-right leader, Jean-Marie Le Pen, in order to win over National Front supporters to his own centre-right party, wooing them with the promise by setting up a Ministry of Immigration and National Identity. By literally sucking Le Pen's blood, Sarkozy eventually reduced the Le Pen vote to around 10% from its previous high of 18% in 2002. Before becoming president as French Interior Minister, Sarkozy imposed stricter measures on illegal immigrants, a policy that was strengthened post-May 2007 by introducing annual limits on the number of immigrants and stricter measures for immigrants that did not have the necessary visas and documentation. His government aggressively pursued selective immigration, favouring the arrival of qualified workers. Sarkozy was notorious for his refusal to allow Turkey to join the EU. So no wonder we can call this type of film Sarkozy horror. If we let anyone in, the films suggest, then look at the havoc that they will wreak. Sarkozy would be a fan, I'm sure. So Frontières embodies a powerful trauma narrative that foregrounds contemporary events to highlight current national fears, riots in Paris, urban dissolution, youth-police clashes, and proposes a radical alternative in which the extreme right are on the verge of taking power. That did happen, as I say, in the 2002 presidential election. There was almost a scenario where that would have happened. And in an interview shortly before the film's release, Gentz declared that his inspiration for Frontières came from the presidential elections of 2002. Quote, "That was the most horrible day of my life. The idea of frontiers came to me then, and in it I have put all that I love from the cinema of horror from the 70s and the 80s. And so, true to Gentz's upbringing and film influences, midway through the film, these documentary impulses are replaced by more conventional horror ideas, and Frontières mutates into an example of a rural Gothic horror film in which the countryside is coded as dangerous, reactionary, violent, uncultured. The family they encounter in the countryside are far more right-wing than the government on the verge of being sworn in. The mutant von Giesler family, and here is the father, Herr von Giesler, who, for those of you who know French politics, looks uncannily like Jean-Marie Le Pen, embodies a virulent strain of French racism. Their plot is to rid France of impure blood. North African immigrants are top of their list, and propagate their pure genes through various intergenerational rituals. It is clear, therefore, that they despise the Arab Parisians that have reached their motel because they lack racial purity. And this idea of meat as murder, youth as murder, is played throughout the whole of the film. Now, interestingly, the heroine of Frontières, here she is Yasmin, a North African, crucially, a North African young woman from the outskirts of Paris who escapes all matter of physical and mental degradation, kills the family, and is saved. I said at the beginning that all the characters in these films die. She is one of the few characters in all of those 20 or so horror films that we looked at the beginning that actually survives the carnage. And it's interesting that she's female, that she's young, that she's from the outskirts of Paris, and most crucially of all, she is a Boer. She is a second generation North African immigrant. So, Frontières, like other French horror films that we've looked at, use violated bodies and the abject hidden away in the furthest reaches of the French countryside to continue the tradition established in new French horror of rendering gore a key constituent element of the horror aesthetic. In these films that we see, the horror we are shown is not something from out there, something that is strange, something that we cannot understand, something that we cannot defeat, but is actually something that is living amongst us and caused by us. One can't help thinking that Gentz in this film is using the possibility of a far-right government and the restoration of a fascist ideology as collective national punishment for the events of 2002 and then the unchecked rise of Sarkozy's immigration plans. So, in summing up, the future of French horror cinema seems rich in possibilities. I would finally suggest that the return of the horrific can be linked to one other thing, and that's evolving genre imperatives within the French film industry.
Il était enfermé dans une chambre froide. Elle vivait là. Elle n'a pas été violée, c'est une certitude. Lucie ne raconte pas ce qu'elle a vécu.
Pourquoi tu crois qu'on a besoin de toi?
Lucie, vous voulez attraper les gens qui ont fait du mal à Lucie?
C'est ça, Anna.
Elle sait pas qui c'est. Il faisait tout noir. Elle croit qu'elle se souvient, puis des fois non.
Qu'est-ce qu'elle t'a dit d'autre au juste?
Elle a peur.
Elle te raconte des choses?
Elle dit qu'il faut les attraper.
Qu'est-ce que t'as fait? J'ai juste les faire. Lucie, tu devais les observer, t'étais pas sûre. C'est eux, Anna. Lucie, ça fait 15 ans. Mais je l'ai dit! Je l'ai fait! Regarde, je l'ai fait. Où est-ce que t'as trouvé le fusil? Ça se trouve pas en dessous. T'as fini? Après, on s'en va. Elle est là. Elle est dans la maison.
Lucie Jurin nous a échappé il y a 15 ans, n'est-ce pas?
Je l'ai tuée!
Lucie n'est qu'une victime, comme toutes les autres. C'est si facile de créer une victime, mademoiselle, si facile. Le monde est ainsi fait qu'il n'y a plus que des victimes. Les martyrs sont très rares.
Pourquoi tu l'as défendu? Elle a rien fait ici. Elle a fait du mal à moi. À moi! Tu m'as jamais cru. Je pense que je suis folle comme les autres. Arrête. Lucie! Tu vois, je vais m'en sortir.
Since the early 1990s, French cinema has sought to boost its international presence to combat the pressure of globalizing economic forces and stronger competition from Hollywood blockbusters via a recourse to commercial genres such as comedy, the OSS 117 series, live action animation, Gérard Depardieu in Asterix and Obelix, for example, and quite a few people's favorite films, science fiction, The Fifth Element. These films not only imitate the Hollywood production model through the adoption of star actors and a glossy visual style, but also, despite their French provenance, almost seem non-French. They bear little marks of Frenchness because they are designed to appeal both to a domestic and an international audience. And horror has gone down the same line, I think, as well since 2002. It thrives domestically by providing a viable alternative to American products, but then it recasts them in new light. And it's also proved beneficial. Many of the directors that we've looked at today are now working in America. There are more French directors working in America now than at any time since the end of the Second World War. And these directors are directing Hollywood-financed horror films, thriller films, supernatural films, and so on. So it seems to me that the horror film dynamics across separate national cinemas are actually being brought back into focus, and especially into focus with American mainstream horror. French cinema, of course, can be distinguished by specific national, linguistic and cultural parameters, but it too is also subject to the flows of the global film economy and the dissolution of rigid national cinema boundaries. Perhaps it's too early to say whether these films constitute a conscious attempt to beat American cinema at its own game, given that these new directions in French cinema have only really been happening for 15 years or so, and perhaps we need much longer. We need to see the long tail, if you like, to see if that's going to play out in the future. But what is important is the cultural specificity of the political context that French horror films are engaging with, and their re-engagement with irony-free gore, violence, and a succession of harrowing imagery to shock us with the new. When that secure border between inside and outside gives way, look what happens, the French are telling us. The word horror derives from the Latin word horrere, meaning to stand on end, one's hair, to tremble and to shudder. So here's to more trembling and more shuddering. Thank you.
very much, Ben. Are there any questions for Ben? Oh, one already.
We have that microphone there.
I'm reading a couple of books about real-life Australian crime.
Oh, yes.
And I think a lot of the cases I have read are worse than any horror any director or writer could imagine, and some of what the victims have been through. And all of those things that you talked about, like invasion and body snatching and all that happens in real life. A lot of the crimes are people coming into someone's house, murdering them, or grabbing them off the street and having them for a few weeks before they murder them, and things like that.
Sure.
And Snowtown, the family murders, and a lot of those others that you don't hear about, all have those sort of particulars about them. And I'm wondering whether not just the political situation and that sort of thing, but a lot of real life has influenced horror.
Absolutely. Thanks for that. It's certainly true that a number of directors that I've been referring to tonight, their first inspiration, if you like, to get inspiration for many of their films is simply to read the newspapers. And they've often said that several of their narratives, not all of them have been made yet, but certainly ideas that they have been that kind of ripped from the headlines sort of style of filmmaking, where they look and they read about domestic invasion, for example, imprisonment, and so I certainly think that what's happening in Australian fiction and the things that you're talking about certainly true in France as well. And obviously, the last few years we've had all these horrific stories of young girls that have been kept prisoner in basements by various individuals, and they've escaped. And a lot of the films mimic that sort of narrative. A child or now a young woman often escapes and then is kind of dragged back into that world. So I think there's a lot of similarity there, and a lot of they read perhaps the same sorts of things as well, and are being inspired by those particularly gruesome events.
The new movies, like the French movies, are obviously using a lot of tropes borrowed from 80s horror movies as well.
Yes.
However, what I have noticed, especially with the French horror, is the use of isolation and rural settings. Do you think that that's probably one of the sort of forces of success for these movies, as it sort of it provides that extra sort of bit of fear in the fact of the unknown? Absolutely,
it's exactly that. I think if a lot of those films happened in Paris, for example, or in a city, that level of intensity, that level of claustrophobia would certainly not be as heightened. It's almost ironic that they have to be taken into the middle of nowhere for us to feel even more claustrophobic. It's those big, wide open spaces, the countryside that you talk about, the forest, the woods, very similar to Australian horror in many respects. That big, wide expanse of land actually on the surface is very idyllic and very pastoral and often very beautifully shot. But beneath it is that sense of isolation and that sense that out there in the uncivilized part of France that we don't often see in films, of course. It's very often a film industry that's based in the city, the sorts of films that they show. I think that the filmmakers are clearly saying that outside of those parameters, there's a lot of strange things happening. Oh, hi, Steph.
Hi, really enjoyed it. Thank you so much, Ben. Something I was interested in that you touched on is that France, as you mentioned, has this sort of history and tradition of horror that goes back almost before films. I thought it was interesting. At the same time, you sort of gave us a sense of how French film is borrowing almost like American tropes, and you've got Dracula and the sort of European myth. I'm interested, how much do you think French film is working at all on particular French myths almost? Do you think they're sort of re-evaluating particular stories or concerns, or is it more like almost taking on other narratives from other countries? Oh,
look, I think that they're looking at their own myths and legends and fairy tales, for example. I can't remember the exact name of it, but the Brotherhood of the Wolf, the film I was talking about before that's set in pre-revolutionary France, is about the beast of Gévaudan. I'm looking at John here to see if that's true, where there was a sort of a mythical animal that went around the countryside and killed people. And so that film is set sort of in the 21st century. Is kind of looking back into the past and appropriating those myths and modernising them with special effects and things like that, bringing them right up to date. I would say certainly that the slasher films that I was talking about, they're very much, I think, have come out of that American tradition of the 70s and 80s, the slasher tradition, the domestic invasion tradition. But I think that certainly the earlier films, the black and white films in particular that I was talking about, absolutely are based on those classic horror novels and tropes and fairy tales and legends, both within a French but also a European setting as well.
There was a question over here.
As an extension to that last question, I noticed with a lot of the screen captures that you showed, a lot like Saw and those kind of cinema in terms of
yes.
Like even just the color palettes and perhaps the cinematography. I was wondering if French horror cinema has developed, or if contemporary horror cinema has developed its own unique style in terms of cinematography and effects, and whether there is any influence of other European horror films from the 70s and 80s, such as the Italian giallo films and like the zombie exploitation films.
Sure, great question, thank you. It's certainly true that a number of the cinematographers on these French films have actually worked in American horror films as well, so I think that it's going back to the idea I was talking about of flows backwards and forwards across the different national cinemas. So, you know, American cinematographers are bringing with them their own ideas and their own visual style, if you like, that they're importing into that French context. I agree with your point too about the giallo, and certainly a lot of those very bloody French films are referring back to those Italian films of the 1970s with that very stark use of red on white, the kind of very, very stark bleached out look that we get to see. You're absolutely right as well, insofar as that style of the bleached out look, I think is kind of germane to all horror film actually, or certainly of the last 20 or 30 years or so, precisely because it creates that much more realistic setting, I think, by bleaching out a lot of those images and those ideas that might make it seem to be exaggerated or stylized, by sort of stripping it back almost to a kind of documentary style look at you know, inside a particular room or inside a particular house, taking away a lot of those colors. I think has also helped create that idea of a somber palette, but at the same time is one that is increasingly sort of has blood thrown at it, if you like, at very particular moments during the film.
One more question.
Oh.
Thanks for a terrific lecture, Ben.
Thanks, Howard.
For people who don't know Ben very well, I live on the same corridor as his colleague, and after seeing this, I'm even more surprised why he is the most cheerful person in the world. But never mind. My question is a little bit about the paradox of how these movies may or may not have that wonderfully political message, but presented in such a repulsive way that you wonder, how do you get the message across to more than some of the real horror fanatics?
Sure.
Is that their purpose at all, or do they just don't care about that?
Look, it's a great question. They don't care. I mean, I guess it's my job, one of the joys of my job is to look at those films over and over again and actually try to pull out things, you know. Whether we do it in a comedy film or in a classic film or in a costume drama or in a horror film, you know, I always think that there's something there to be looked at, you know, that the text is there, but beneath the text, there are a number of subtexts that we want to pull out. If you go onto those blogs, if you go onto those message sites, people don't care about that at all. They're just delighted to see a new, exciting way to see the body ripped apart or destroyed in some particular way. So it's almost for them, you know, the gore fans, the aficionados that I was talking about, for them it's simply a film for film's sake, if you like, and there isn't a deeper meaning, there isn't a subtext, and they don't go looking for it. But at the same time, I think increasingly now, because those films contain such overt political references, I think even the gore aficionados are starting to actually trace across a number of different films those ideas, and they start to see, well, that director's made 2 or 3 films of that particular kind. Maybe that director has an idea or a series of ideas that he wants to communicate that isn't just the visceral and the horrific, but is also perhaps politically tinged as well. Thanks.
So I'm going to take Chairman's prerogative here. I've got a question that was very similar to that if it's reflecting the events, as you said, but does it have any consequences in terms of influencing people's beliefs? I mean, is there any evidence that people become more xenophobic because they identify with the fears?
Look, I haven't done enough on this to be able to answer that question, but I think that would be a really interesting study with now to kind of do a kind of a reception theory study of those audiences and actually say, okay, what do you feel about these films? Have these films influenced the way in which you think, you talk about these issues, you communicate these ideas, or so on? When I was at university, I was always told off by my history tutors to not be reflectionist, to not look at films and say, well, the film is reflecting a particular era, because, of course, films, there are only 5 or 6 films that come out, so how can they reflect a whole era or a whole period or a whole mindset? But I think, on the other hand, we can argue that films do tap in to the collective zeitgeist. It's such a global medium, it's such an accessible medium, more so than any other, I suspect, that actually asking those questions deeply to the people that watch the films would be a really interesting thing to look at. How much has your own ideas around immigration, for example, been changed by these films?
Yeah. Terrific. Excuse me, I'm just going to have to hop over here.
Oh.
That was a wonderful talk. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm not sure I'm going to sleep tonight, but I think I should be drinking this. But anyway, here's a small
Thank you very much.
token of our appreciation for the talk.
Thank you.
So I'd like to finish up by letting you know about our last Research Tuesdays event for the year. Next month we have a special forum to discuss autism. We'll be hearing from a number of researchers looking at the underlying genetics of autism, educational psychology, and even theatre performance by autistic people. And we're very pleased to have Autism South Australia joining us for that event. That's Tuesday the 9th of December in the Braves Lecture Theatre, and we hope that you'll join us. So thank you all again for coming, and good night.